The second question that was sent to me from Aaron is this: what is John measuring in Revelation chapter 11, verse 1? And after the Antichrist has made his peace treaty with Israel, will it be available for devout Jews to get right with God? And if so, how? So this question deals specifically with a verse in Revelation chapter 11, verse 1. But actually, I think if I'm being true to the question, we're talking about Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. And it goes like this. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Now, a little context here. Revelation is a book that falls under the genre of apocalyptic literature. It's really the only book in the New Testament that fits pretty squarely into that category. It was written by the Apostle John, the disciple of Jesus. John, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, who was the only apostle of Jesus, as far as we know. He's the only one of the 12 to die of natural causes, who lived to be an old man. And he wrote this revelation that he received from Jesus Christ when he was in prison on the island of Patmos. Now, he died of natural causes, but he endured a great amount of suffering for the name of Jesus Christ and for the kingdom. We have records from church history of John not only being imprisoned, but whipped, beaten, boiled alive, and then he didn't die, of all sorts of things that he went through. But most scholars believe that he wrote this when he was an old man in the 90s AD. So at the very end of the first century, years after 70 AD, when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. Why does that matter, and why is that important? It must be said, for starters, that there are 4 different ways that Revelation has been interpreted throughout church history. And I'm going to briefly tell you about them, so that I can answer this question in a way that I feel is faithful, okay? Because there's different opinions on almost everything in Revelation. So there's the historicist view, there's the preterist view, there's the futurist view, and there's the idealist view of Revelation. Those are the 4 ways that Revelation has been interpreted throughout church history. In various times, different ways of interpreting Revelation have become more popular, and at other times, others. In today's world, in modern Protestant evangelicalism, the most popular way of interpreting Revelation is the futurist interpretation, where most people will tell you that most everything that happens in Revelation happens in the future, and it hasn't happened yet. I agree with that in some ways, but I actually believe that the right way to understand Revelation is to understand the futurist view, the preterist view, and the idealist view all at once. The historicist view, I personally don't really agree with. I don't think it makes much sense. I think that it's an idea that someone came up with that seemed to stick, but there's no other place in the Bible that we would ever even think to interpret like people interpret Revelation using the historicist view. So the historicist view basically interprets Revelation as if it were a map of church history. So it is basically a series of events that take place chronologically in between Christ's first and second coming. And depending on where you're at in the book, you're in some specific time in history between the first and second comings. So the historicist view believes that all of the 7 churches that are listed in the beginning of the book in chapters 2 and 3, in 2 out of the first 3 chapters, represent periods of time in church history. Now, I don't think that that's true, because I don't think there's anything in the text that clues us into that or gives us an impression or a reason to believe that. And the big problem with the historicist view is it seems to be a moving target, right? Everybody always seems to think that they're at the tail end of it, And then they have to go back in history and sort of realign all the different periods of time and say, well, this is this seal, and this is this bowl of wrath, and this is this trumpet. But it's always changing, that particular hermeneutic, and I don't really agree with it. By the way, if you want a great resource for Revelation and you want to understand the ways that it's been classically interpreted, there's a book by a friend of the program, Steve Gregg, who wrote a commentary called Revelation 4 Views. And it's in my library. It's on my shelf. I find it to be a helpful resource, definitely. And I think it's really helpful for people who have never really waded into these waters before. Now, the preterist view of Revelation reads Revelation as if most everything in it has already taken place. And for full preterists, they believe that everything has taken place, including the second coming of Jesus, which I do not agree with. And most people in the church do not agree with that. Are there strengths to the preterist view of Revelation? Absolutely. I believe that every book in the Bible has a specific application that was meant for the original audience. Okay? This is why I don't think the futurist view can be taken on its own when it comes to Revelation and said, well, this is all about stuff that hasn't really taken place yet. Because if that's true, and remember, Revelation is addressed to 7 churches that existed in the first century, meaning that when this was first written by John, there was an intended audience of real people in real churches who existed. And it said, Jesus tells John, write this and send it to the churches. This is for them. Now, if everything in the book has yet to take place and it's all for the future, why would Jesus tell John to send it to the 7 churches in Asia Minor who it's addressed to? If there's absolutely zero application for them and it has absolutely no bearing on their life, there's no immediate context or interpretation for them, why would he do that? That's why I don't believe in a full futurist view, but I also don't believe in a full preterist view, because I don't believe that everything in the book has taken place. I believe it's somewhere in the middle. And I also believe in the idealist view, which is the 4th one, which depicts Revelation more or less as a great drama that is depicting spiritual realities. That's depicting depicting events that will happen over and over again in church history. They happened in the first century and they'll happen again. And they're not meant to just be about one specific thing, or maybe they are, but they also apply to all sorts of other events that take place that will look like the original events, right? So in the original story, we've got a great empire that comes together with other empires that are represented by this beast that comes out of the ocean, and he wants to dominate. He wants to have total power and total control over people. And what he does is suppress and persecute and martyr the people of God. Y'all, that spoke loudly and clearly to the original audience because they were living under Roman persecution. You know who else it speaks loudly and clearly to? The church in North Korea today. The church in India today. The church in Cambodia and Sri Lanka. The church more and more, once again, in communist China. It doesn't really speak that loudly to us in America yet, but it very, very much does speak loudly to churches in other parts of the world that are persecuted, that are much more persecuted than we are. So I believe that a correct understanding of Revelation takes the preterist view, the futurist view, and the idealist view all into account. If I had to choose one, it would be a mix between, well, if I had to choose one, it would be idealist. But ideally, I take all 3 views into account. Okay, now let's talk about this question specifically, because Aaron's question was, what is John measuring in Revelation chapter 11, verse 1? And then the second part of the question is about the Antichrist, and I'll get to that next. So the issue of the temple in Revelation chapter 11 has much to do with what you think about Revelation and how you interpret it and when it was written. If you think that this book was written before 70 AD and you're a preterist, you think John is likely talking about the actual temple that existed in Jerusalem before it was torn down by the Romans. And this is an event that Jesus prophesied about in Matthew 24 explicitly. Did you know that in the 2nd century, there was a Christian apologist, one of the first Christian apologists actually, named Justin Martyr, who used the Gospels and Jesus's prophecy to prove that he was the Messiah and that his prophecies actually came to pass? Because he showed a bunch of Roman elites one of the gospel records of Jesus predicting the fall of the Jerusalem temple and said, how could this man have known that this was going to take place 40 years before it happened? And this is how he converted people, by showing them that Jesus's prophecies were all correct. So if you're a preterist and you think that Revelation was written before 70 AD, you think this is probably about the temple that existed in the 1st century that Jesus visited often and that he promised would be torn down. If you're a futurist, you probably think that this is about a future 3rd temple, which is something that many Christians believe will be erected in the future, partly because of this passage, partly also because of allusions to other things, allusions in other passages of the New Testament that may be talking about a temple, like 2 Thessalonians 2, when the man of lawlessness takes his seat in the holy place. Now, I used to very strongly believe that there would be a 3rd future temple, and I even taught that. I'm not as convinced anymore. And the reason for that is because I have a much fuller understanding of Revelation now than I did then. And there's nowhere in the New Testament I can explicitly point to that says there's going to be a 3rd temple. More importantly, I understand how the word temple is used most of the time in the New Testament. And the way it's used most of the time in the New Testament is as a reference to us, the people of God, the church, the place that God is building up, the structure that God is building up into a perfect habitation. This is from Ephesians, i.e., his body, his church. We are the temple of God. What passages in the New Testament refer to us as the temple of God? Well, just a few I listed quickly before I started. 1 Corinthians 3, 2 Corinthians 6, Ephesians 2, 1 Peter 2, just to name a few off the top of my head. I believe that in this passage, most likely, John is actually making a reference to the temple as the people of God. I believe that this number that you see all through the book of Revelation, 1,260 days, or times time and a half time, or 3.5 years, it's repeated in various forms all through the book, actually most of the time represents the entire period between the first and second coming of Jesus. I believe that when John talks about the temple and John taking a measuring rod, like a staff, he's told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. He's saying, look, take a survey of my people. See how many people on this earth are becoming a part of my family and of my kingdom. He says, the court outside the temple don't measure. And most interpreters throughout history, definitely most of the idealist and historicist interpreters, believe that this is a reference to people who are a part of the visible church, but who aren't actually Christians, who aren't actually saved. Leave them out because they are given over to the nations and they will trample the holy city, the nations, that is, for 42 months. There's another reference to that period of time, 3.5 years. That's the period of time that Revelation gives us That's either a reference to a future 3.5-year tribulation, or it's a reference to the entire church age, or it's a reference to the 3.5 years that the Romans besieged Jerusalem between 66 AD and 70 AD, or it's a reference to all three. And I believe it's probably a reference to all three. This is how amazing this book of Revelation is. And God could possibly have seen all of this and inspired a book that covers so many different things at once. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, I want to encourage you to visit our website, thatyoumayknowhim.com. There you will find all of our past videos, all of our past podcast episodes, and our podcast series cataloged and categorized, as well as our blog, Coffee with God, where you'll find Bible studies, devotions, and biblical and theological articles, all for free. We don't charge for anything whatsoever on our website. I started this ministry back in 2021, and if you feel led to do so, we would love your support. Every little bit helps. $20 a month, $10 a month, even $5 a month goes a long way to helping us accomplish our mission of illuminating biblical truth, applying it to faith, life, and culture, so that you can know and love and walk with Jesus like never before. Look, this verse leads right into the section of Revelation where the two witnesses are introduced. And the two witnesses, lots of people today say those are two literal people who are going to literally prophesy in Jerusalem for 3.5 years during the last 3.5 years, or 3.5 of the last 7 years on earth before Jesus comes back. The problem with all this futurist eschatology is there's nowhere in the Bible you can go where it actually is laid out explicitly. It's all sort of taken from here and there and then melded together by people's brains. There's nowhere you can go to in the New Testament to substantiate the claim that there's going to be a 7-year tribulation. And if there is, would you please show me where? Because there's nowhere that explicitly says that. This idea comes from slapping together several different passages that come from Daniel and that come from Revelation and that come from these separate places. But the number that Revelation gives us is always the same period of time. 42 months, 1,260 days, 3.5 years, times time and a half time. I believe that the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11 actually represent the church in the entire age between the first and second comings of Christ. And I've done an entire teaching, a long, in-depth study on this. If you want to get really into the weeds and understand why I think that, you can go check that out. I'm not sure. I think maybe my friend Christine, who's moderating today, can link that in the chat if she can find it. It's on our Revelation playlist on our YouTube channel. But there are many reasons I have for believing that the two witnesses represent the church throughout the entire church age, and specifically the Jewish and Gentile factions of the church that come together to witness to the one Lord Jesus Christ. So what do I think about the temple in Revelation chapter 11? Look, there's one other thing I need to say, actually. John's told to measure the temple here, but there's no measurements that are actually given. The measurements are reserved for Revelation 21, when not the new temple, but the new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. And its measurements are given, and they are exorbitant. It's 1,500 miles in all directions. So the New Jerusalem is 1,500 miles up, 1,500 miles deep, 1,500 miles wide. It's 1,500 by 1,500 by 1,500. It's shaped like a cube. I don't think it's meant for us to say, oh, wow, the New Jerusalem is going to be 1,500 miles straight up in the air. We must be able to float. I believe it's a way of John depicting it's massive. It's massive. It's like a brand new earth coming down out of heaven for us to dwell in forever. You see, all through the Bibles, cities are not really viewed as good things. All through the Old Testament, cities are where people go to sin. It's out in the wilderness, in the desert, in the more sparse areas where people like Abraham decide to stay. where there aren't so many people coming together doing wicked things. Remember what happened at the Tower of Babel? The people were coming together and devising all sorts of evil. So God scattered them by scattering their languages, because when they came together, they were doing evil. This starts to shift when Jerusalem becomes the city of God during the reign of King David. And we see it come into fullness at the very end of the Bible, when not a new whole earth. Well, there is a new earth, but a new city comes out of heaven for all of God's people to dwell in. And now we can all be together in one place, and we will produce nothing but righteous fruit. No more sin. It's pretty awesome. Christine just linked that in the chat. Thank you so much for doing that, sister. I really appreciate it. I'll make sure it's in the show notes as well, our teaching on the two witnesses. So I believe that Revelation 11 is John being told to measure the church, the people of God, the new temple, and that we're not really told how broad and how wide and how big we are yet, but we're being told, like we're being given a preview of what's to come later on in the book. And it's important also to note, I keep coming up with more things to say. Lastly, leave that out. The outer court of the temple, don't measure that. Leave that out, for it's to be given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. Look, during this entire church age, Satan, or the dragon, is trying to pursue and trample over the people of God. And he can't do it. And the reason he can't do it is because he has no power or authority to do so. Even if Satan martyrs a Christian, is that a defeat for us? Absolutely not. It's a victory, because we go straight from here to the presence of the Lord, and our legacy lives on forever as one who loved Christ more than our own lives. We loved not our own lives, even unto death. We were actually willing to follow him to the fullest extent by picking up our cross, laying down our lives, by being seeds that go into the ground. So the devil can pursue the people of God all he wants. He has no power over us. He has no power because there's nothing left he can take. Our lives don't belong to him. They're not even in his purview. But for those that give in and step away from the faith, and that turn away from the faith and become people of the world and join the court outside the temple, they get trampled. Because if they get taken out, where they go afterward is not glorious. It's not eternal reward. It's the opposite. Now, let me circle back to the last part of Aaron's question. It says, after the Antichrist has made his peace treaty with Israel, will it be available for devout Jews to get right with God? And if so, how? Now, that part of the question sort of assumes a futurist reading of Revelation. I'll have you know, there is no specific mention of the Antichrist in Revelation. Can you believe that? The beast is mentioned, and the beast is assumed and thought rightly to be the Antichrist, but that phrase Antichrist is only used in 1st and 2nd John. Is there one other place it's used? There might be, but I can't think of it. I think it might only be 1st and 2nd John. Now, there's other phrases like the man of lawlessness, 2nd Thessalonians, like the beast in Revelation 13. But Aaron's question, if let's just assume that the futurist view, at least in terms of there being a future 3.5-year tribulation and there being an Antichrist who makes a treaty with Israel, and this idea is based sort of off of a certain reading of Daniel, a certain reading of 2nd Thessalonians, and a certain reading of Zechariah. Sorry, couldn't come to me. 12 to 14. If that were the case, and in the future it's also based off of a specific reading of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 24. Although I don't necessarily agree with any of those passages being about a future tribulation, but if that were to happen, and the nation of Israel, as we understand it being constituted today, were to make a treaty with the Antichrist, would that prohibit individual Jewish people from getting right with God, devout Jewish people, I can't see any reason why it would. All through the Old Testament, look, this is something that is really misconstrued a lot in terms of the way we in the church talk about covenants and salvation. We tend to think of ancient Israel as being the covenant people of God. And if you were Jewish in the Old Testament, you were saved. And if you weren't, you weren't. That's not how it is anywhere in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God made a covenant with Israel, but you weren't automatically just accepted into God's covenant just by being Jewish. You had to keep the covenant. You had to keep the laws. You had to follow God's ways. You had to be a part of his people willingly, willfully. If you did that, you were accepted. And it didn't matter if you were Jew or Gentile or not. There are numerous Gentiles listed in Jesus's own genealogy, like Rahab and Ruth, 2 women even, which was a sort of a scandalous thing to do in the first century, write a genealogy of the Messiah with women listed in it, right? It's always, always, always been about the heart, even though we think that because the heart and individual faith is so emphasized in the New Testament, that wasn't the case in the Old Testament. Look, it always has been the case. God's very clear with the Israelites at the end of the Torah. I've laid before you life and death. You can choose to walk in my ways and be faithful to me. And if you do, I will bless you and I will be faithful to you. And if you don't, if you choose to go the way of death, you'll be cursed and I will turn my face away from you. Eventually, he turned his face away from the whole nation, but he still had people who loved him and who he loved and who he preserved. And I believe the same is true today. I believe the same will be true into the future until Christ returns. If Israel makes a covenant with the Antichrist sometime in the future, and there are individual Jews who recognize this and recognize Jesus as their Messiah and turn to him, they will be saved. Oh, awesome. Christine's looking up where Antichrist is used. 1 John 2, 2, 4, and 4. Yeah, and I think it's in 2 John 2. I think it's in 2 John. Anyway, don't let me get off track here. But thank you for doing that, sister. I believe that the only time someone has lost the opportunity to come to faith and get right with God, to be specific about the question, is when they're dead. It's when their life's over. Is there going to be a chance after death for people to repent? There's various views all through church history about that. I tend toward no, but I think a person can get right with God as long as they are still drawing breath and they humble themselves and turn to him. There is one thing that's very clear, though, when we talk about someone being a devout Jew in Israel, there ain't no getting right with God without Jesus Christ. You will not come to the Father but through him. He was very clear about that. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. That much is crystal, crystal clear. Thanks for watching. My name is Blake, and over the past 20 years, I've been a missionary, a pastor, and a Bible college and seminary professor. During that entire time, I've been teaching the Bible. And if you want more Bible content to come your way, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video. And also, check out this video right here.